Go.
All right.
Stuart, yes.
Before we get to Talmud, I don't know, would you be willing to just comment on the Prime Minister's breaking of Shabbat for what seems like a pretty remote possibility of saving lives? I mean, how does halakha look at how realistic does the possibility of saving lives have to be in order to break the laws of Shabbat?
Just very, very quickly, it's one finally decent thing that he did, and there's no question about it that this was something that you break Shabbat even for an uncertain possibility of saving a life, and how much more so when we're talking about saving thousands of lives. So there's absolutely no halachic question that what he did was totally with in consonance with Jewish values, and I hope and pray that something positive will result from that. But if nothing positive results from that, still he tried, and that's absolutely what the Torah tells you to do. Absolutely.
For those of us who haven't been paying attention, can you tell me what the Prime Minister did? Was this his trip to Russia?
The Israeli Prime Minister flew on Shabbat.
He flew on Shabbat.
Okay. To try to broker some kind of arrangement or compromise or something to try to change the reality, and so he used his standing as being actually a kind of a friend of Putin to be able to talk to Putin and the Ukraine, and then he went to Germany. So he tried to be a kind of a mediator in the situation, and he did it specifically on Shabbat.
Okay. Thank you.
So that was Stuart's question, right?
Thank you.
And the fact that he didn't do it 3 weeks ago is unfortunate, but that doesn't mean that this Shabbat he shouldn't have done. Right.
I guess better late than never sometimes actually works.
Yeah. Okay. So we are, wait, now I lost my place. Yes, we are at 16A4.
15A or 15B?
16, 1-6.
16, sorry.
A4. We're on the left-hand column, and we are talking about Esther's confrontation now. She has brought Achashverosh and Haman to their feast, and this is her chance now, and she accuses Haman of, she finally, puts it all out there that Haman is trying to kill the Jews and trying to kill me. I'm a Jew, says Esther. And we had a whole thing there about the angel, making sure that she does it in a way that doesn't alienate Achashverosh, so that Achashverosh doesn't get upset with her, but instead only upset with Haman. And now we're the middle of the left-hand column where it says the Megillah records Achashverosh's reaction to this news, right? That this terrible, evil man Haman has been trying to destroy the queen and her people. Okay, who's going to read from there, please? Going once. All right, there you go, Bill. The king rose in the bridge.
The Megillah records Achashverosh's reaction to this news. The king rose in his rage, etc., and went to the garden while Haman remained to beg Queen Esther for his life. The king returned from the palace garden. The verse compares his returning to his rising. Just as his rising to go to the garden was in rage, so too was his returning from the garden in rage. For Achashverosh went out to the garden and found ministering angels who appeared to him to be men, and they were uprooting the trees of the garden. And he demanded of them, "What are you doing, destroying my garden?" They answered, "For Haman ordered us to do this."
Okay, so we get a little frame up here, right? There's a divine frame up of Haman, that Achashverosh goes out of the room. He's really, really upset. when he goes out of the room, does his rage subside? We're going to find out later on his rage subsides. But did he get any kind of relief by going out of the room? So the answer is no. Here, God is keeping the pressure on, keeping him upset, and keeping him focused on this terrible Achashverosh guy. And it's an interesting kind of image, right? He sees the garden of his the royal gardens being uprooted, right, being destroyed. And he says, "What's going on? I never authorized this. I never said that this is what should be done. I didn't tell the gardeners to replant the trees over here or move this over there." So the answer was, well, Haman told us to do it. So this, of course, feeds right into his growing paranoia that Haman wants to kill the queen. Who's next? Is this a power grab on Haman's part? Haman has presented himself as being a loyal retainer of the king. And as you know, every tyrant develops that kind of suspicion and that kind of fear. The people that are closest to me are also the people that have the opportunity, the best opportunity to get rid of me. So this is exacerbated here by his vision of the garden being destroyed at Haman's orders. Okay, a little Freudian maybe. Okay, good. No, you're on mute again.
All right. The Gemara explains the end of the verse. Achashverosh then came into the house, where, as the verse states, and Haman was falling on the couch upon which Esther was. The Gemara, analyzing this verse, asks, why is the present tense "he was falling" used? Haman had already fallen on Esther's couch to beg for mercy. The past tense "he had fallen" should have been used. The Gemara answers, Rabbi Elazar said, this teaches that as Haman tried to get up from the couch, an angel came and pushed him back down on it, so that Ahasuerus would think that Haman was assaulting the queen. Upon seeing this, Ahasuerus said, woe from the inside, woe from the outside. The verse concludes, the king said, would you also assault the queen while I am in the house?
Okay, so what we've seen now in a number of the last part of last week's discussion, and now again, angels are coming in and beginning to start being active, right? The angel saves Esther when she's about to make a mistake that would have jeopardized her argument. The angels go out into the garden and make Achashverosh more upset at Haman. And now the same thing again. The angel comes. Haman is going to pull himself together. He sees that the king is coming back into the room. He was on the bed. It was a kind of a little bit of an awkward, compromising scene. He wanted to jump up and not look so abject and not look again suspicious. And the angel trips him up, so that instead of seeing him getting up from the bed or standing there, or he sees Haman jumping onto the bed, falling onto the bed as if he's about to try to attack the queen, physically, maybe sexually. And that's what he says, right? He says, I'm here and you have the chutzpah to try to assault the queen while I am actually here, right? So this is all thanks to divine intervention. So what we have here is the rabbis multiplying the invisible hand of God that was working, and of course is never mentioned in the book. But this is the way that the miraculous salvation of the Jewish people could happen. The non-rabbinic way of looking at this is coincidence, right? And what the rabbis are saying, no coincidences here. This is all, being engineered actively by God's agents. Good.
At this point, Charvona said, etc.
Okay, what did he say? What did he say? Let's look at 52 just to get the whole
Note
verse.
52 from Esther 7:9. The verse in its entirety reads, and Charvona, one of the chamberlains in attendance of the king, said, furthermore, the gallows that Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good for the king, is standing in Haman's house at a height of 50 amot. And the king said, hang him on it.
Hang him on it.
Hang him on it.
Right. So this is so Charbona gives the king the information about this specific plans that Haman had developed for Mordecai. And of course, Mordecai has just been raised in the king's estimation. He got reminded that Mordecai is responsible for saving his life. So this, just completely, falls into a pattern that the king now discerns, that Charbona is not my helper, Charbona is my enemy. Charbona is out to get me and anybody that's been good to me. Haman now has, I have evidence now that Haman has been plotting in one form or another to eliminate my supporters and probably eventually to eliminate me. So, of course, this is not good for Haman. So Charbona is the one who tells him that piece of news. When we sing on Purim, Shoshanat Yaakov, right? We sing a whole song celebrating the Purim story and God's saving of the Jewish people. And we say, Arur Haman, Baruch Mordechai, cursed be Haman, and blessed be Mordechai. Arura Zeresh, cursed be Zeresh, Haman's wife. Brucha Esther, blessed be Esther. And then at the end we say, V'gam Charbona Zachur Latov. And we should remember for good also Charbona, because Charbona stepped up and turned government witness, right? He turned into a cooperative witness to get Haman out of the way. But now we're going to get some of the backstory about how the rabbis see Charbona. Go ahead.
Rabbi Elazar said, Charbona too was originally a wicked participant in that council which advised Haman to hang Mordecai. However, when he saw that his counsel would not be fulfilled, he immediately fled from Haman's side and now tried to help Mordecai. And in reference to this, it is written, and he, God, will cast on him the wicked man, and he will not pity. From his assistance, he, his former ally, will surely flee.
Okay, so that's the verse quoted by the Talmud. And this is the idea that, fleeing a sinking boat, right? So that Charbona thought originally that it would be a good idea to support Haman. Haman seemed to be on a roll. And now, as he sees the tables being turned, he says, oh, how am I going to save my own neck? So this is a little bit of a cynical kind of, realistic appraisal. What, Charbona was such a good guy? Yeah, well, it's good that he turned, but he turned, to be on the good side, because he was reading the tea leaves. He saw what was happening. That wasn't his original plan. So, of course, this is a jaundiced view in general of the realpolitik of court life and of power politics, and that's the way that they're seeing Charbona as well. Okay. So now, of course, we have poetic justice, right? Charbona says to the king, Haman was preparing this gallows for Mordecai, who saved your life, good guy. So then Achashverosh says, okay, poetic justice. Let's use the gallows for the right purpose and hang Haman. Okay.
Achashverosh orders Haman to be hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger abated.
Now the king's anger abates, right? So this rage that has been going on since he first heard about what's been going on behind his back and without his understanding, now finally, once he executes Haman, he feels much better.
The Gemara asks, why are these two abatements mentioned? The Gemara explains that two angers abated. One was the anger of the king of the universe, and one was the anger of Achashverosh.
Right. So since the word shachacha is used, Shachacha has a double chaf in it. So shachacha gives this idea of abating and then abating some more. The note explains that it could have said shacha, but it said shachacha, right? Kept on abating. So that's why the Gemara says, what's this, more than one kind of abating? What is this idea that there's more than one easing up of anger? So now we say that the word hamelech, right? V'chamat hamelech shachacha, the king's anger abated, is two abatings and two kings, one with a capital K and one with a small k. One is the king of the world, God, and one is Achashverosh. So we've had this already again and again and again in our reading of the Megillah, to keeping on inserting a reference to God. Oh, when it says the king, it's not necessarily the king Achashverosh, it's the king of the universe. We had that, remember, Balaylahu Nadadash Nata Melech. On that evening, that night, the king's sleep was upset, and we say it means the king. This is the turning point from the dark side to the light side. So over here as well, one is the anger of God. In other words, all this trouble that the Jewish people were in, all the anxiety, all of the fear, all of the terrible sense of doom, and we see this, of course, unfortunately, now among multitudes of people who are just holding onto each other in subway tunnels and on the roads and in all kinds of places where they're just in total dread. So the Jewish people at that point were in a similar kind of psychological and physical state of fear and danger, and that was now taken away. So God was no longer, torturing us, so to speak, with that kind of sense of imminent demise. And the other one was back to Achashverosh. Achashverosh himself felt better, right? He got it out of his system. He felt relieved. Okay. Alternatively, 16A5.
Alternatively, and others say that both refer to the angers of Achashverosh against Haman, one on account of what Haman had sought to do to Esther, and one on account of what Haman had done to Vashti.
So now we get a little more psychological about Achashverosh, and now Achashverosh has double resentments, double anger. Right? He understands that what Achashverosh has been doing all along was terrible. When he thought Haman was on his side and he followed his advice for Vashti to get rid of Vashti, he was persuaded by Haman's conspiracy theory that Vashti was out to get him, and therefore instead, when it was actually Haman the whole time, it was out to get him. So he eliminated Vashti at Haman's advice, and then it started eating at him because he still felt connected to Vashti. And then the replacement for Vashti, Esther, now he sees that Haman wanted to destroy her as well. So these are two things to be upset about, and now he feels he's gotten his revenge. Okay. And if anybody has anything to comment on or share, the mic is always open. Okay, the Gemara.
Sorry.
You're on mute. Yeah,
I got it. Good. The Gemara now expounds a verse in Genesis that details Joseph's gifts to his brothers because it foreshadows Mordecai's success here.
Okay, so we're doing a little zigzagging, right? Where we take another piece of Torah from someplace else, we look at it, we ask questions about it, and then we end up finding a thread, almost literally, a thread that ties one episode in the Torah far, far away, ostensibly completely independent and freestanding from anything that we're looking at now. And we begin to start weaving a connection back to the story that we're preoccupied with. This is, as we've seen many, many times, this is one of the great enjoyments of Midrash. And I don't mean the people who read Midrash. I'm talking about the people who create Midrash. One of the great enjoyments of the Midrashic creators was how many different ways can I connect disparate pieces of the Torah to each other. If I can find something that looks like it's totally unconnected to what I'm studying at the moment, and I can bring it somehow in sync with what I'm studying here, so that each piece of Torah sheds light on the other, then this is a gloriously wonderful thing to do. So there's a beautiful story that's told in the Midrash about one sage who was a student of Rabbi Akiva, and disciples of Rabbi Akiva run into their master, run to Rabbi Akiva, and they say, Master, come quick. There's a glowing fire that is surrounding, I think it's I always mix them up. It's either Ben Zoma or Ben Azai. I forget which one it was. They were afraid that this was some kind of like inexplicable phenomenon, and it, the fire looked frightening. So they needed their teacher to come out and deal with it. So he runs out and he says, Ben Azai, are you engaged in some kind of mystical experience, which is the reason that the heavenly fires are coming down and surrounding you? And he says, I'm simply connecting one verse in the Bible with another verse in the Bible and seeing how they come together. And I'm making the verses as joyous as when they were first given at Mount Sinai. The verses are delighted with my endeavors to show that they're all connected. So this is and that's the signal from heaven, this blazing fire like Mount Sinai. When God came down to Mount Sinai with the fire and the thunder and the lightning and so on. So the idea of being able to make connections, right? As one, only connect, make connections. This is what the Midrashic project is very much about. And in a certain sense, the exact opposite of critical scholarship, right? Critical scholarship works very hard to break things down into pieces. And in biblical scholarship, the idea of finding all of the differences, in how God is referred to, and what does this, what is this piece of text, assuming theologically or legally or so on, it doesn't jibe with the other piece of text. Clearly, this is 2 different sources, 4 different sources, 10 different sources, and so on. The Midrashic approach is the opposite. The Midrashic approach is everything that looks different has a deeper connective tissue to it, so that even if they end up emerging looking different, there's a subterranean connection of roots and nourishment that binds it all as one. So here we're going to have a discussion now from the Joseph story. What does that have to do with anything in Purim? The answer is watch and see. Okay. Yeah, Stuart.
Well, I just was noting that it's not just in Gemara that it occurs, but even in the Mishnah itself, like on the previous page where there's a reference to Job, that it doesn't give us any explanation of it, but it's a connection that would not occur to someone who didn't have a very, very deep knowledge of Tanakh.
This is fundamental to the whole rabbinic enterprise.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Gemara sometimes, I guess, expounds on it, or maybe finds connections that are even less literal than At least in that case, in Job, it was literally it applied. Here, it's just kind of comes, it almost comes out of the blue, this reference to
Yeah,
Joseph.
absolutely, right, correct. Some stretches are little stretches and some stretches are big stretches. Go ahead. All right.
The verse states, to each of them, Joseph gave changes of clothing, but to Benjamin, he gave 5 changes of clothing.
Okay. So this is at the end of, toward the end of the Joseph and his brother's story. And he has revealed himself finally after the whole convoluted, drama with his brothers who didn't know who he was and so on and so forth. And he finally has he engineers it so that all of the brothers have to be together with him. They originally resisted. They didn't want to bring Benjamin down from the land of Canaan to come down to Egypt because they thought that this would break Jacob's heart. But he finally pushes them and they have no choice. They bring Benjamin there. And then, of course, he breaks down crying and he reveals himself and says, don't you recognize me? I'm your brother. I'm your brother Joseph. And then they all dine together. They fall on you're going to get it in soon. They cry over each other's embrace, and he gives each of the brothers gifts, but he gives more gifts to Benjamin. So he gives 5 cloaks or articles of clothing to Benjamin, and this is above and beyond what he gave to his other brothers. Okay, so now the Gemara starts asking a question. Gemara asks.
The Gemara asks, is it possible that the very thing that this righteous man, Joseph, suffered,
now we're on 16b1,
he himself should stumble over?
Okay, so what's the question? The question is, this is not fair. It's not equal treatment. How did Joseph get into all of his problems? Because his father treated him with favoritism against the other brothers. He gave him that cloak of many colors, or that striped cloak, or special cloak, whatever you want to call it, the ketonet pasim. So that's what engendered all of the resentment, and that's what made the brothers hate him so much, and maybe exacerbated his own sense of being conceited and oblivious to the feelings of others. So that was a terrible mistake that Jacob made. So now he's going to fall into the same trap, and he's going to treat his brother differently than the other brothers and give this brother more. Isn't he asking for the beginning or the resurgence of the same kind of poison that he's trying to overcome? Why is he stirring the pot like that? Why is he doing something so terrible? Okay, so here's the Gemara's answer.
For Rava bar Mechatya said in the name of Rav Chama
Okay, we're not going to get to the answer yet. We're going to, but go ahead.
Who said in the name of Rav, on account of 2 selahs worth of a fine woolen garment that Jacob gave to Joseph in excess of what he gave to Joseph's other brothers, the matter evolved until Joseph was sold by his brothers and our forefathers descended to Egypt. Therefore, if this favored treatment resulted in jealousy, why did Joseph, of all people, repeat this mistake by favoring Benjamin and presenting him with 5 changes of clothing?
Right. So why did Joseph do something that seems so insensitive and so oblivious and so against the whole project that he was trying to achieve? So we're going to get to the answer actually in a second, but we have I think an interesting side, again, a kind of a little side path that we could benefit from looking at. Look at note 4.
Note 4. Actually, as Tosafot to Shabbat 10b, etc., observes, the Egyptian servitude had already been decreed from the time of Abraham. However, had there been no hatred among Jacob's sons, perhaps the oppression would have been less severe.
Okay, so this is now bringing us, we've had this kind of question in one form or another again and again and again. When God establishes a covenant with Abraham, God already predicts the future to Abraham and says that your children, you will have children. This is before Abraham even has any children. He says, you're going to have children, but guess what? Your children will be oppressed and enslaved, but don't worry, I'm going to look after them, and I will eventually judge their oppressors, and I will take them out, and they will come back to their homeland, and happy ending, right? So God already speaks to Abraham way before Joseph, and tells Abraham that the Egyptian bondage is foreordained. It's determined. So what does it mean here that actually Jacob's favoritism caused the trouble of going down to Egypt? Why, that because he mistreats he shows favoritism to one son.
Right.
The other sons get angry and resentful. They sell Joseph down to slavery to Egypt. Then they have to get punished and they have to be brought down to Egypt. And we end up coming down to Egypt, right? So that looks like a whole, chain of actions that come out of Jacob's mistake. But they were going to get down to Egypt anyway, right? Because God said that was necessary as part of the historical process of creating a Jewish people. So how do we make sense of this? So you have here in that note, you have one item, one element of a way of thinking about this. What's being highlighted in the note as an attempted solution?
Well, the note simply says that, yeah, God may have decreed this already, but had there been no hatred among Jacob's sons, the oppression might have been less severe. That seems to be questioning God's judgment.
Well, I don't know. Why is it questioning God's judgment?
Well, God said they're going to be slaves in Egypt for X number of years, and now the note is saying, well, maybe they wouldn't have been there for 400 years. Maybe it would have been less in time, or the oppression would have been less onerous.
So how does that question the judgment? God says that they're going to be oppressed. Guess what? There are degrees of oppression.
Okay.
Right.
You're right.
So,
Yep.
so the point being that we made it worse. The fact that we're going to go into exile is a given. But why do we have to make it worse?
Yes.
Why do we have to fight with each other? Why do we have to hate each other? It's bad enough that the Goyim hate us. Why do we have to hate ourselves? That's part of what this note is trying to say. So Jacob's misstep causes a conflagration within our own people of our not getting along, right? So why does Joseph now reinforce that kind of possibility of our not getting along with each other? So this is one way of looking at it. There's another interesting variation a little bit on this, which is suggested by another commentator. The number that's given is 400 years, right? They will endure this situation for 400 years before they will be redeemed. That's what God says. Arba me'ot shana. And this is counted from the time when Isaac is born. So Isaac is born, and Abraham is in exile in Philistia. He's on the outskirts of the land of Canaan. He's not in, set and comfortable in his own home. So the exile starts there. That would be so that's the the terminus, ad quem or something like that, whatever it's called. The exile is one thing, the eretz lo lahem, but then the question is vavadum. the being enslaved, when does that start? So it actually didn't start 400 years. It started when we got down to Egypt. So what one suggestion is that if Jacob hadn't been so insensitive, and if he hadn't created this terrible situation within the family, maybe we wouldn't have gone down to Egypt for another 100 years. Maybe the slavery wouldn't have lasted so long. Maybe the slavery would have been for 50 years, for 20 years, right? There was no magic number for how long we had to be enslaved. We made the slavery last longer because we couldn't get along with each other, and we drove our own selves down to Egypt. So that's another kind of rueful way of thinking about how we can be our own worst enemies. We talked about it before. On Yom Kippur in the traditional liturgy, we talk about the martyrs of Israel. The martyrology is a section of our Yom Kippur Musaf prayers. And we have a story of the 10 martyrs that were executed by the Roman government. Asara Harugei Malchut, including Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel, all because the Romans, tried to forbid engaging in Torah, and then they took 10 sages of Israel and executed them because they defied the Roman prohibitions. And the introduction to that story is that why were these innocent, holy people brought to such a painful and horrific end? And the answer is because the sin of the 10 brothers who sold Joseph was never adequately settled. So it's a horrifying kind of idea. We're not going to get into the theology of it right now, but I'm just saying that it lives on in our sense of the betrayal of the brothers of their own brother is something that stays with us as a skeleton in the closet, if you want to say, a poison that has never fully been, or until that point maybe, never fully been set to rest. And that's part of this question now. What is Joseph doing? It's such a horrible idea that the brothers turned on him and basically were contented to lead him to his death. How could Joseph now reactivate that kind of dynamic? So that's the force of the question. All right.
The Gemara answers. Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said, Joseph hinted to Benjamin by giving him these 5 changes of clothing that in the future a son, Mordechai, would issue from him, who would go forth from before the king attired in 5 royal garments. As it is said, and Mordechai left in royal apparel of blue, etc. The verse proceeds to enumerate the 5 garments that Mordechai was wearing. QED.
Okay. Right. If you look at 8.
Note 8 says the verse in its entirety reads, Mordechai left the king's presence in a royal apparel of 1 blue and 2 white, with 3 a large gold crown, and 4 a robe of fine linen, and 5 purple. Then the city of Shushan was cheerful and glad.
Okay, so there are 5 accoutrements to Mordechai's royal costume, and that was being alluded to. Joseph was saying to Benjamin, down through the ages, right? Many, many years from now, you will have a descendant of yours, because Mordechai comes from Benjamin, and he will be clothed in 5 different pieces of clothing. So this is a prophetic statement, and it's not about treating the brother better than anybody else, but saying to the brother, you should know that eventually you're going to have somebody from you who's going to save the Jewish people, and you should be happy. If you look at verse 6, look at note 6.
Note 6.
Because still, I mean, after all, isn't he still giving more to Benjamin than to everybody else? So look at look at note 6.
Had note 6. According to this interpretation, the one garment that Joseph presented to each of the other brothers was equal in value to the 5 garments that he presented to Benjamin. Therefore, there was no cause for jealousy. As to why Joseph was not concerned about creating jealousy when he gave Benjamin an extra 300 pieces of silver, see Maharsha and
Right. So that
Torah
you'll do on your own. But we still, so the point here being that, yes, he gave him more garments, but they were cheaper. So all of the brothers felt that they were equally well served. But the reason that Joseph didn't give Benjamin a fancy, garment just like he gave to the other brothers that was worth $500. Instead, he gave Benjamin, 5 $100 garments. Everybody else got a $500 garment. So the answer was because he wanted to give him this extra piece of good news that a Benjaminite would eventually be a savior for Israel. To a certain degree, there's also a little bit of poetic connection here, because who is the one brother who was not guilty of attacking Joseph?
Judah, no?
No, Benjamin. Benjamin. All the other ones did what they did, and then they had second thoughts, and they had regrets, and they tried to back out of it, and so on. But they were all in on the original plan. The 10 brothers were there, but how many brothers are there? There are 12.
12.
So 10 brothers against Joseph, that still makes 11. Where's the 12th? The answer is Benjamin. Benjamin is the only brother who is completely clean and innocent of anything. However, we might say psychologically that doesn't solve the problem completely. We have something called survivor's guilt, for instance, where somebody who doesn't participate in the trouble of everybody else that they're connected to feels unworthy. And Benjamin could have said, if only I could have been able to save my brother. If only I could have been able to somehow intervene. Why wasn't I able to calm things down, make peace among the brothers, and so on? This could have been something that was festering in Benjamin, and Joseph says to him, "You were okay. You couldn't do it, but guess what? One day, one of your children will save the Jewish people." Right? You weren't able to save me. You weren't able to intervene. But one day, the legacy will pass down, and your caring will make a difference, because Mordechai will be the one. Jen.
So, in that view of it, wouldn't Benjamin be thinking, "Oh, if only I could have saved him from the wild animal or something"? Because presumably, are we thinking that the brothers came home and said, "Oh," they confessed everything to Benjamin, but not their father? So presumably, he didn't know until when he's being brought to Joseph, he didn't know what happened.
We always go through these questions when we go through that story. How much does anybody know about this? Or how much do they suspect, but they don't want to talk about it? How much do they think maybe, but if they say it, then it might become real, and they want to remain in denial. So those are festering questions. And on top of that, what I would say is that Benjamin may feel, that they didn't confess that they tried to kill him, but he was there the whole time, that they couldn't stand him, that they couldn't talk to him, that they couldn't, be human toward him. So that's it's all speculative. Everything I'm saying is just another speculation, right? Okay.
Having expounded on one verse that describes the meeting of Joseph and his brothers, the Gemara elaborates further. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. The word Suraya.
Chevrah. Tzavrei.
Savrei
The word
is written-
tzavar is a neck, and tzavarei
The
sounds like the neck of, like it's plural.
somebody. The word savarei is written in plural form as necks. Therefore, the Gemara asks, how many necks did Benjamin have? Logical question. The Gemara answers, Rabbi Elazar said, Scripture used the plural form to teach that Joseph wept over the two temples that were destined to be in Benjamin's territory and were destined to be destroyed.
Okay, so if you look at the notes, for instance, the temples are called a tzavar. They're called a neck, as a kind of a tower. The temples were built on the mountain, right? To be higher than the rest of the landscape, so that people would ascend and go up to pilgrimage to the temple. So here we have again the Gemara imagining that, these ancient stories, everybody knows what's going to unfold. Everybody is privy to the whole unfolding of Jewish history and knows what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. So on the one hand, we have Joseph reassuring Benjamin that Mordechai will come to save the Jews. So that's wonderful. That's the good news. On the other hand, Mordechai saves the Jews, but after the destruction of the first temple, and guess what? His saving the Jews doesn't bring the Messiah, because we come back eventually to Israel, and then we suffer again. So we've gotten it again and again. So we have this tension between celebrating, and that's what Purim is also about, right? Celebrating when we can, even though the bigger picture is still not perfect, right? We don't wait to celebrate until the Messiah comes and everything has been solved. We take these small moments of redemption, these small moments of light, and we hold on to them and celebrate them, even though those moments of light are surrounded by other moments of chaos and darkness. Yeah, Josie. No, still.
I'm very much struck by these connections that are being made from one generation of scholars to the next. And I'm beginning to get a picture then of Judaism in the 21st century, which seems so fragmented. It's really all tied up in all these connections. And as long as we have those, we're not just floating around in Montclair in 2022. The connection piece seems to me very central to where we are
well
today.
said. I agree with you, and I think that's also the challenge, and it's complicated. Some people can chafe at this kind of way of presenting these stories, because it's fairy tales, it's not logical, it doesn't really comport with our historical sense of what happened when and who knew what when, right? It's a fantasy in a certain way, right? This idea that Joseph knows that it's eventually going to, but because what's happening is that these stories are being used as screens upon which we project our present sense of reality and sense of history, and we can make the connections now because we've got 20/20 hindsight, right? We've got the perfect perspective, because we are looking backwards and not forwards, but we imagine that other people could have looked forwards. So some people really hate that. There are people, and there's a danger to it, because if you make Jewish history into simply a fairy tale, then you don't take responsibility for actually acting in history in a responsible way. So there's a whole very fundamentalist kind of religious Jewish community that takes this stuff literally almost, and not almost. And therefore their whole perspective on how things should happen, or what we ourselves should be doing in response to the situations today, are corrupted and skewed because they believe in these in fairy tales as literal. So but then the choice is, so what do we do? So we just throw out the fairy tales? We don't, we shouldn't read Grimm's fairy tales. There's a whole bunch of people that say that we shouldn't read Grimm's fairy tales. I think it's an idiocy, but they're very serious. They're very righteous. They're very much about, let's be ethical and let's be realistic. And I think that the challenge is actually being able to hold on to those things both, and enrich both sides with the other, and keep both sides alive, because otherwise I think that we will desiccate, we will dry up our approach to being human and to being Jewish. I'm going to say one more thing, and then people who want to comment, I'll be happy to have everybody comment. I want to say just one more thing, and that is, in order to do this, you have to be immersed in the story. You have to actually be interested in learning the story, and then you can appreciate when somebody tells the story a little bit differently, or when somebody makes the connections that you otherwise wouldn't have known. But if you don't know the story, you don't even know it when somebody's making a connection. So you need to know the story. And that's a basic challenge in Jewish education, to have these stories be vivid and be present for people starting from when they're kids, starting from when they're young. And it starts with, the basics. Who is Abraham? Who is Sarah? Who is Joseph? Who is, Deborah? If the kids don't know those stories, Esther, and so on, and they don't understand some of the interlocking forces, the story just becomes, again, a fairy tale that they outgrow and forget. So keeping that kind of sense of wonderment and enjoyment, and then adding the sophistication and the critical faculties, that's what it means to actually, in my view, I'm being overly simplistic, but that's certainly one of the ways that it's significant to try to be a Jew that's studying Judaism. So some people wanted to say some things. Jen.
So I think we have this capacity when we take a non-religious text. Like if you look at Tolkien fan sites, everyone knows this is fiction, and yet you can dive deep and have all sorts of commentaries. And some of it's ugly, like the recent, oh my gosh, you can't have somebody black in this world or whatever. So it can get very ugly place too. But there's no problem when it's not, when you've removed it from a religious setting, for people to really take it deeply seriously without having any kind of understanding that it, without saying that it ever happened or having that whole fundamentalist argument. I'm always wondering, why is it so, if you're already a person, I understand there's when you're religious about something, you get more into what happened and didn't happen, and it's interestingly historically, but I wonder why at no point, why it's so much harder for us to separate from that, just to set historical questions aside and just appreciate it as a story, when we can do it so easily if there wasn't a religious basis already, and get just as fanatical and almost religious about it anyway.
So that's the difference. The difference is almost, almost is no cigar. Tolkien is a close contender for being a religious text, but not quite, right? And that's the extra problem with religious texts. Religious texts are understood to be making some demand on you. For Tolkien, it can be very, and I haven't read Tolkien, but the phenomenon is a known phenomenon, and fandom, we've talked about it thanks to you. I think it's very valuable to think about those things. But being a fan of a particular show or a particular creation, and Trekkie, what was it called? Trekkies, right?
Trekkies.
Trekkies got into it, and it became almost like a religion, right? You had certain pilgrimage festivals, and you had all kinds of stuff, but there was behind it, there was some kind of sense of the unreality of it, and the joy of it being fun and being a story. And the problem with religious texts is that they're claiming to be more than that. And certainly with the Torah, they're claiming to be making demands on you. They're claiming to so if it's fairy tales, then the demands fall away. Then it's whatever I want and whatever I enjoy or not. And of course, in modern times, this is a huge struggle for all of us. How seriously do we take these texts as orienting texts for our life? Right? Or is it just simply something that, I'm a fan of the Torah. It's nice. So this is a struggle. This is a struggle that freedom of modern times has given to each and every one of us. There's no longer that kind of unquestioning assumption that this is my story because I have no choice. I have no other story. The fact that we live in a wide open world and we can read whatever we want, and we can tune into whatever we want, and we can not tune into whatever we don't want to. So that extreme freedom has brought us to where we are today. Yeah, Sylvia.
You mentioned Star Trek, and I don't know much about it, but I do know that there's a whole subset of study indicating studying its relationship to Judaism.
Right. Well, there was this,
and so it becomes a sort of grayish area, where you go from one way of thinking to another. It raises interesting questions.
What was Dr. Spock's the actor's name? What was his name?
Nimoy.
Leonard Nimoy.
Right. So Nimoy was a Jew, and he imported into the aspects of Trekkiness. So he imported the priestly blessing sign and so on and so forth. So that was fun for him. He made a connection.
But I think it went much beyond that. It went to the writing.
All right.
As I say, I know people whose minds I deeply respect, who really looked into this.
William Shatner is Jewish too, isn't he, Jen?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. But the creator of Star Trek was not Jewish, despite that persistent rumor. He was not a Jew. He was an atheist humanist who was not born Jewish.
The creator of the whole story.
Star Trek, was whose name I forget at the moment. I'm sorry. It was very funny in fandom in
Cohen,
Star Trek.
I think his name was Cohen. Yeah. No, just kidding.
Gene Roddenberry.
Yes, Roddenberry. Thank you. I actually had a whole argument about that at Torah study once with Zev. What's Zev's last name? Who married Heidi. Yeah. He was like, no, he has to be Jewish. I was like, but he isn't. So the guy has no connection to Judaism. I'm sorry. Not only Jews are humanists.
That's right. Although there's a whole industry as well, back to Sylvia's point, there's a whole industry as well, for instance, about Superman and about superheroes, because there's a predominant well over the
Superman, Batman,
right.
Goes on and
a lot
on
of the superheroes are Jewish creations, and then they're sort of like traced back to the idea of a Messiah complex and a Messiah yearning to right the world and finally save the world because of the miserableness of our situation. So there's a lot of, the Jews have contributed a lot of stuff. It's true.
But it's like the creation story. Every society that's ever lived in this world has a creation story.
So
everybody wants to know how we got here and where we're going.
Right. So everybody's entitled to their story. And reading other stories can be enlightening and wonderful. But what I was saying before is, and it can't be taken for granted anymore, whether we know our story. That's the question. And whether we want a story, or do we want to say, oh, you know what? Creation stories, it's a cultural phenomenon. Once upon a time, when people didn't know any better, they created creation stories. That's, again, back to the Torah says, no, I am not an old relic from 4,000 years ago. You got to read me this year, you got to read me next year, and you got to read me and make sense out of what I'm saying. And Gilgamesh, you don't have to read every year. Whatever other creation stories there are. So that's our challenge. Do we take this as our story? Do we want to make it our story? And in what sense is it more than just a story? That's the question. Okay, and of course the Megillah is a beautiful subset of that. Right? It's a beautiful sub-example within the bigger story of the Torah. It's a little bit cool to think that the last piece of Torah that was added to the Torah is this weird, comic, absurd story without God's name in it, but which we then have to struggle and say, are we going to make this a story that's a holy story for us or not? So it sort of highlights the idea that it's up to us to embrace the story. Sylvia.
Well, I missed the very beginning. I'm sorry. And I know you were discussing Ukraine when I tuned in. But how will the current situation, Rabbi, impact the way you present Purim this year?
I'm not in charge of the Purim festivities this year, so I don't know exactly what's happening in terms of the plans. I have a feeling that it's going to be sort of sidestepped to a certain extent, and that's partly fine. I mentioned before, grab the joy where you can. Grab this moment of celebration, and for many people that itself is going to be a resistance, to say you're not going to stop me from celebrating my religion and my calendar. So I think that there's a lot of meaning in that. I've been talking about Ukraine the last few weeks every Shabbos. So the framing and sometimes in our classes. So the framing is not going to have to necessarily be, in my mind, how we're going to change or tweak or color the Purim itself. It's part of the ongoing context that we're creating at Shomrei. But tomorrow I can decide to say something else. So, and if people bring it up, then absolutely legitimate to talk about it. Yeah, Josie.
Sounds like, from what I've seen of announcements, that it's going to be fun for the children and geared to that level of enjoyment. But what Sylvia is talking about and you are talking about is much more serious.
Well, so that's the thing. So, what, only kids have fun? Are we not supposed to, try to, recapture our inner child? So yes, Purim has multiple levels. It's got this kind of silliness. It's got this very kiddie, immature quality to it. And what we've been spending, I don't know how long already are we studying this, this tractate? We keep on discovering that there's a lot of political, psychological, social, ethical, moral, sexual, adult material, to contemplate in this story as well. So we're bringing that to bear. One thing that I've said in other conversations, there is a super serious moment in the Megillah, which I've highlighted over the years repeatedly, because it is to me the core moment in the Megillah. And we had it a little while back when Mordechai says to Esther, you have to go and try to save the Jewish people. And she says, are you kidding? You know, it's going to be off with my head. He's, you know, he only allows people to come in if he invites them. He hasn't invited me for the longest time. And Mordechai says, I get it. And then he says, look, the Jewish people will be saved by hook or by crook. I don't know how, but somehow or other, the Jewish people will be saved, maybe from some other venue. But who knows if it's not for this very moment that you have attained your royal position. You have to decide, you know, people have been writing about, you know, which side of history do you want to be on? So you have to decide, Esther, why are you where you are? And why are you what you are? What are you going to do with that? And it applies to world leaders. It applies to presidents and prime ministers and ambassadors and generals. But then it applies to everybody. It applies to you and to me and to everybody. Why are we who we are, where we are, and what we are at this moment? And do we respond to that question, to that series of questions? What's the answer? What are we going to say? All right, maybe we'll stop here. And we have one more session before Purim. So let's see how much further we can get. We're really almost at the end of this Midrashic collection. So maybe next time we'll actually make it. And then you'll be able to go into Purim with, like, you know, all your notes, you know, sitting there at the reading of the Megillah and getting it all in. All right.
Appreciate that.
Have a great
Yasher Koach.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe, everybody.
Yasher